We mentioned this morning in our sermon, we're gonna finish out this lesson that we started looking at the dangers of alcohol. Of course, as we looked this morning, we considered the first 2 points that we can draw from those first couple of verses there in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 29 and 30. We looked at 2 different points, the first of which being how alcohol affects everyone. The point we made in that primarily dealing with how it is that some of the reasoning that people give as to why it is they drink is because they say, well, it's not affecting anyone and it's just something that I do. But when we look in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 29, we see that it affects more than just us. It says Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 29, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? And so we considered those different questions and how it is that affects us as well as others. But we considered as well from verse 30 how it is that alcohol is dangerous because of its addictive nature. Considered some different things that went along with that, but as Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 30 says, those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine. And of course, we dealt with that more in depth this morning. And so this evening, what we're going to do is finish out this lesson. And because of the nature of it, just for the sake of time and everything else, we're going to kind of change things up. Of course, normally in the evening, we try to do it like a Bible class. And so we'll have more interaction and comments and questions. But again, just because of the nature of the lesson, the sake of time tonight, we'll just kind of treat this more like a lecture, you might say. So certainly that doesn't mean sit there and turn your ears and your brain off. Of course, please continue following along here in your Bible with me, and let's consider these things together. Because the next thing we'll note as it relates to the dangers of alcohol is that alcohol is deceptive. That's the next point we're going to find based out of verses 31 and 32. It says, do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. One of the reasons, again, that alcohol is so dangerous and it is so deadly is because it is so deceptive. We turn on the TV and we watch the commercials. We hear the advertisements. We see the posters. We see all of these things that deal with alcohol, and it always looks like you can't have a great time unless you're drinking. That the best-looking people are always going to be drinking. That the best parties, the most fun that's going to be had is going to in some way be revolved around alcohol. But the thing is that's a lie. The industry is great at what they do. They have to find ways to make alcohol appealing. They have to find ways to try to appeal to our pride and to everything about us to try and get us to give in, to give them some money so that we will partake in what it is that they are offering. What we see is that alcohol is truly deceptive. You think about how it is to the world that when we get together as brethren, when it is perhaps we're celebrating a birthday, when it is that we're celebrating a holiday, whatever it may be, when we get together and we're able to have a good time without alcohol involved in that, the world just can't comprehend it. It does not make any sense to them because to the world they have been deceived. And they can't understand why it is that we can do what we do, how we can have a good time without alcohol being involved. But that's the nature of sin. Sin in and of itself is deceptive. It's not just alcohol, but it is sin as a whole that is deceptive. You think about how it is that at the first, whatever promises that particular sin might make, whether it's alcohol, whether it's adultery, whether it's gambling, whatever it may be, sin is something that is enticing to us. That on the surface, it looks like something that's great. That promises are made to us that seem almost too good to be true, and then we give into that desire. But what we come to find out is that the pleasure that comes from it, it's only temporary. You think about what we learn of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 25. The context there is not dealing with alcohol, but as it relates to a principle we learn about sin. That sin certainly is pleasurable, but that pleasure is only there for a season. And the same is true with alcohol, even as we considered this morning. That the deeper we go into sin, The deeper we get into the bottle, the more difficult it becomes to get out of it. And the longer that we stay there, the more people that we drag down with us. Alcohol is deceptive because it is enticing. Again, you just think about the nature of sin. If sin were not pleasurable, there would be no temptation for us to give in. You look in James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, where you can see the cycle of temptation and sin. That all sin begins with desire. That's the temptation. That we are tempted when we are drawn away by our own desires and enticed. And when that desire is given into and conceived, well, that gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Sin is something that's enticing. And alcohol is certainly no exception to that rule. You look in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 31, where the Proverbs writer says, "Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly." The very first portion of verse 31 says not to be fooled by the look of the alcohol. That as it's being poured out into the glass, it looks good. That it looks like something that's going to be refreshing. That again, we've seen the advertisements, we see the parties, that everybody has a great time when they start to drink a little bit. But it's deceptive. The Proverbs writer says not to even look at it. That's so wise. We talked a little bit this morning, even it was mentioned in Bible class as well, about how at many times we start to straddle the fence. That we want to get as close to it as we can. That we want to be near it. We might not give into it, but we don't quite want to give those things up. And so maybe it is that we're not going to drink, but why don't we just go and hang out with the people that do? I can go to this party and I'm not going to drink like everybody else. Why would we get close to it? If we know that the desire is going to be there, if we know that there is a lure behind it, that it's enticing to us, why would we put ourselves in that situation? Especially when we're talking about something that is so dangerous, something that is so deadly. Because it's not the case that the Proverbs writer says you can go be near it all you want to and don't worry about taking a drink of it. He says don't even look at it. Don't even look at it so that the temptation cannot be there before your eyes. This is something that is so dangerous, that is so enticing. But at the same time, when we look at the end of the verse, the Proverbs writer says, don't be fooled by its smoothness. Maybe it is that we do look at the drink, but we decide it's okay if we take just a little sip. It's not going to hurt anything. And so maybe we take that first sip and it's been mixed up just right as they were doing here in the Proverbs. And maybe it's so palatable to us and it smells so good and maybe it tastes good to us, and so we think, I can take just a little bit more. I can drink just a little bit more, that it's not affecting me right now. But understand what the Proverbs writer is saying. Don't be fooled by how smooth it may be. As he says there at the end of verse 31, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. The impression, depending on what we're looking at here, when we're talking about these translations of the Hebrew, the impression can be that he's still just talking about looking at it. But when we actually go and start to break it down, what he's talking about is how the alcohol goes down smoothly. Again, how it is that it may not be that hard for us to drink. It looks good. It may smell good. It may taste good. But the Proverbs writer says, do not be fooled by this. Don't be fooled. Don't look at it. Don't be fooled when it starts to go down smoothly. Because what we learn from verse 32, because alcohol is deceptive, even though it may be enticing, it is certainly deadly. Again, verse 32 says at the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Think about the deadly venom of a snake. Snakes, many times, they may grow large, but you think about how it is that it's the smallest snakes that are the most dangerous. They can't control the venom that they put out. So when that snake bites, even though it may be little, even though it may seem harmless, consider the effects of that venom. It may cause stroke. It may cause a heart attack. And in many instances, it may even lead to death. It's deadly. And that's how the Proverbs writer says that alcohol affects us. That it may seem good to us. That on the surface we think everything is going to be okay. Even when it is, we start to drink it and it's going down smoothly. The Proverbs writer says, at the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Brethren, we cannot be deceived. Yes, the world says it's all going to be okay. Yes, the alcohol industry says that there's no problem with it. But we cannot give in to that deception. Think about how the world would be changed. Think about how the economy would be changed if it were that every time somebody were to order a drink at a restaurant, that everybody were to come up to the checkout line with the case of beer in their hand, if the cashier, if the waitress, whoever it may be, if they started to read off a warning label, talking about how it's toxic, how it's deadly, talking about all the potential effects of it, how it is that it affects us, that it affects others, how it is that if we're not careful, we can go out and start driving and we can devastate the lives of people we may not even know. Think about if that had to be read every single time that somebody was about to take a drink of alcohol. Anybody who's in their right mind, anybody who is a thinking and a logical person would change their drink order immediately. Consider this that was written by Dr. David Nutt. He's a professor of neuropsychopharmacology. That's a huge word, but basically just talking about somebody who considers the effect of medicine or drugs or any other thing on one's brain. And he's also the chair for the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. And he had this to say about the nature of alcohol. The myth of a safe level of drinking is a powerful claim. It is one that many health professionals appear to believe in, and that the alcohol industry uses to defend its strategy of making the drug readily available. However, the claim is wrong, and the supporting evidence flawed. There is no safe dose of alcohol, for alcohol is a toxin that kills cells such as microorganisms, which is why we use it to preserve food and sterilize skin, needles, etc. Alcohol kills humans too. The toxicity of alcohol is worsened because in order for it to be cleared from the body, it has to be metabolized to acetaldehyde, an even more toxic substance. Any food or drink contaminated with the amount of acetaldehyde that a unit of alcohol produces would be immediately banned as having an unacceptable health risk. And at that point, he links it directly to the FDA's website. Think if that had to be read every single time somebody was about to consume a drop of alcohol. If we understood just how dangerous it is, that it's a toxin that affects our lives and the lives of those around us. That alcohol is something that is truly deceptive. That same professor goes on to say we must not allow apologists for this toxic industry to pull the wool over our eyes with their myth of a safe alcohol dose, however appealing it might be to all us so-called safe drinkers. Brethren, alcohol is deceptive. It seems good. It makes promises that we can have a good time, that we can numb those negative feelings that we have. That it's something that we must have, that we must partake in if we're ever to have a fun and a good time. But we see what the Proverbs writer reveals. We see the truth behind alcohol. At the last, it bites like a serpent. It stings like a viper. Alcohol is so deadly and dangerous because of the way that it deceives. And finally, what we'll note from verses 33 through 35 is that alcohol is dangerous. It is deadly because of how it is that it lowers our inhibitions. This is perhaps the main point that we often think of as we talk about alcohol. That we come to the point of talking about sobriety and the importance of sobriety, that we must have control of our senses, that we need to be in our right mind so that we can be on guard. You think about 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, to be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Sobriety is something that is so important. But if we are not careful, if we give in to the temptation and to the allure of this alcohol, then what we are doing is lowering our inhibitions. And again, people are going to make arguments. People are going to try and justify what they're doing because, well, I'm not at that legal limit of the alcohol in my bloodstream yet. But consider the evidence that we've looked at together. The evidence, the research conducted by renowned scientists, by those who have these degrees, who have the research and the resources available to determine that there is no safe dose of alcohol. Remember these things. Remember how dangerous, how deadly this alcohol truly is. That as we talk about it lowering our inhibitions, what we see is that it alters the way that we look at things. The first part of verse 33 says that your eyes will see strange things. The idea in this is that we start to look at things from a different light. The King James Version here talks about how you will begin to behold strange women. And certainly that's a part of it. That we understand what oftentimes is associated with alcohol. What goes along with these parties. That our eyes start to look at different men or at different women and we know what happens from there. But it's certainly more than that. Your eyes will see strange things that we will become distorted in our sight and in our thought process, which is then reflected in how it is that our guide is altered. You look at the next portion of verse 33, how it talks about your heart will utter perverse things. Now, as we talk about the heart, we understand through the Bible that the heart is the kind of the seat of man. That we understand Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23 that it's from the heart that the issues of life spring forth. But that's an important verse for us to consider as it relates to this subject of alcohol. That if it's from the heart, we'll begin to utter perverse things. You think about Proverbs 4 and verse 23. We are told to keep the heart with all diligence. That means if I understand the importance of my heart, if I understand the importance of what it is I think, of what it is I say, then I will do everything I can to guard it, to maintain that sobriety about me. Because the moment that I slip, the moment I start to partake in that which is going to lower my inhibitions, I'm going to see things I wish I wouldn't have seen. I'm going to start to say things that I wish that I never would have said. And I'll become one who's in a place of grave danger. That's the next thing we learn in verse 34 about alcohol. As we consider the process of this, that it starts out by seeing strange things, that our mind's not thinking right, that our heart begins to utter those perverse things, and we start to say things that normally we would never say. We begin then to find ourselves in situations that otherwise we would never place ourselves in. Notice in verse 34, yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of the mast. What the Proverbs writer is doing here is painting a picture of something that's utterly ridiculous. As it talks about one who lies in the midst of the sea. It may be that we're thinking about somebody who's out in the ocean and they're there and they're just lying on their back, floating out in the middle of it. But that's not what he's talking about. When we look at the word talking about the midst of the sea, that's talking about the depths of the sea. It's talking about one who lies down in the heart of the sea. That you're out in the middle of the ocean, and there you are lying down, not even fighting for your life, on the ocean floor. That's the picture that's being painted here. But he doesn't stop at that. Because he goes on to talk about the one who would lie down at the top of the mast. And it's interesting when we look at that picture. Because the mast would have been that which the sails were connected to. It would have been a primary support beam on the ship. And so when you think about the mast, it's not going to be a space that's large enough for one to lie down on. In fact, some commentators have likened the one who would lie down at the top of the mast to one who would lie down at the edge of a roof. That with one small move, you're going over. And certainly you think about the individual that's lying there. One who's drunk. One who's inebriated. One whose inhibitions have been lowered, who doesn't have full control of themselves or their senses. One who's not going to be able to walk in a straight line. This is the man who's there. He's put himself in a grave and in a dangerous situation. But it's also interesting because at times at the top of the mast, there would have been that lookout position. That there's certain responsibilities involved in being at the top of the mast. That if that's where you were on the ship, you're looking out. You're trying to see if there's land that we're about to run into, if there's a rock that we're about to wreck into. We're seeing if there are any ships coming our direction that we might accidentally cross paths and crash into. But if I've lost control of my senses, if I'm lying down on the job, then I'm failing at my responsibilities. And you think about the process of alcohol in people's lives today. How often it is that alcohol plays a huge role in the loss of our responsibilities. That the more we drink, the more we seek that temporary pleasure, we've become on the brink of losing our families. We find ourselves on the brink of losing our jobs and our income to support ourselves and our families. We find ourselves in these dangerous and in these deadly situations just for a moment's pleasure. It's not worth it in the end. That when we see how it is that alcohol is so dangerous, how it is that it is so deadly and deceptive, what we will find is that it creates nothing but problems. No solutions are going to be found through the drinking of alcohol. That's why the one who's there lying on the ocean floor, the one who's failing at their responsibilities, all because of a drink of alcohol, is never going to solve any problems. Because what we learn in verse 35 is the cycle of addiction is going to continue. That they're going to continue looking for another drink. It says in verse 35 that this is what the man would say. They have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake, that I may find another drink? This verse brings the section full circle. You go back up into verse 29 and you remember the questions there that talk about who has wounds without cause, who has redness of eyes. What it is we talked about, how alcohol affects us physically. This man recognizes that he's been beat, but he doesn't feel it. He understands that he has these wounds, that he's been struck, but he says he wasn't hurt by it. And so why don't I just go back out and do it all again? That's the danger of alcohol. That our inhibitions are lowered to the point that we cannot see what it's doing to us, and we cannot see what it is doing to those around us. As we look at alcohol, it's so dangerous. It affects us, it affects others in so many ways. We consider how it is that it changes our lives, it changes the lives of those around us, and it never is going to create any sort of solution. It's only going to lead to more problems. That when we stop and we logically consider these things, and we weigh out the evidence, how can we not come to the conclusion that this has no place in our lives? But people are going to make excuses. People are going to try and justify it. And it's not just those in the world, but unfortunately there are those within the body of Christ Jesus who would try to justify this as well. But we cannot be deceived. We need to make sure that we weigh these things out, that we consider ourselves, that we use the reasoning abilities that our God has given us. And the conclusion that we logically can come to is that there is no place in our lives for such an addictive, deceptive, mind-altering, and life-changing drug. There's no place for alcohol in the life of a Christian. And perhaps this evening you realize that. But you also recognize maybe it is that you've been failing in this area, that you need to make things right with God. We're blessed here in Mount Vernon with the resources to be able to help us with these things that many other people do not have. We're thankful to have that blessing, to have those resources, but will you take advantage of that today? Will you let us help you with that? Will you make things right with God? And if you need help in any way, won't you let it be known as we stand and as we sing?